What are opals, and how do they contradict an old Earth?
They are always claimed to be hundreds of millions of years old. There's a lot of evidence that that is not so. They formed as Noah's flood, the waters were reaching their peak. Experimentally, they're demonstrated that they are formed within days or weeks. Biologically, they are formed in association with bacteria, which indicates that didn't happen long after the sediments were formed. So with all this evidence, it contradicts the idea that opals formed over millions of years, but rather that they formed rapidly.
My guest here today is going to shine some light onto opals and what they have to do with the age of the Earth. I'm here with Dr. Tas Walker, who has a PhD in engineering and an honours degree in earth science. Now, Tas, you visited and even taught in some of the most famous opal fields in Australia. So can you tell us a little bit about opals and what they have to do with the age of the Earth?
Yes, Michael. I visited Cooper Pedy Opal Field, which is a very, very interesting place, and I've done teaching at that particular opal field and at some underground places at Cooper Pedy. And so opals, they're very, very precious stone, and they're very beautiful. They've got lots of different colours, a kaleidoscope of colours, and that's why they're so valued. That's why they're so desired. And opals are used in jewellery, of course, and they display the different colours. They display colours such as a red colours, which is at one part of the spectrum, the oranges and yellows. They display the blues and also the violets and the purples colours. So opals are very, very desirable for jewellery. And the other thing about opals is that they are always claimed to be hundreds of millions of years old. And we'll find out today that that's not the case. There's a lot of evidence that that is not so. And so it's a very, very amazing thing, opals.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like we need to know a little bit more about opals before we get into the age of them. So I want you to tell me a little bit about why they're so colourful.
Yes, that's one of the things that people imagine. And why are they so colourful? It's not just a colour, but the colour moves. It's like it's alive. A photograph doesn't really do justice to an opal because a photograph is still. But when you turn them in the light, the light moves and flashes and changes. And what it is that opal is a form of silica, and it's actually, if you think of a window pane or of a glass bottle, that's what silica is, or a beach, a beautiful beach with white sand on it, that's silica sand. But an opal is a silica sand which has become absorbed water, and it's become what they call hydrated. And so in that form, it becomes amorphous. It doesn't have any mineral shape. It doesn't have any mineral structure, but it's just in the shape of little balls. And these little balls can be arranged. They're different sizes, and that's what really makes the colour. So if you can imagine, say, marbles, but opal balls are very, very much smaller. If you imagine marbles in a box, they're all the same size. They sit in the box, they all lay down, and it's in layers in the box. And so that's what opals are like. And what happens is when the light comes onto the opal, it is diffracted. It is off the opal into its different colours of the rainbow. And so the colours that come off depend upon the size of the balls. And so if they're large balls, it comes off in the red colour, so reds, the oranges and the yellows. If the balls are smaller, it comes off the blue, the indigo and violet, and then, of course, there's green in the middle. And what happens is that if the balls are not all an even shape, but they're different sizes, then what happens is that it doesn't produce these nice colours. It's just a white sort of a colour, and they call it potch opal. And if the balls are too small, if they're very small, once again, it doesn't produce the nice colours, and it's potch. And potch is not valuable, and people don't like discovering that because you don't get lots of money from it. But the valuable opal is known as the precious opal, which gives the different colours. And the most precious colours are sort of connected with the red end, ones with reds and oranges and yellows.
Yeah, I remember watching a TV show where they're looking for opal in the Australian outback, and they always get excited, but then when all they find is potch, they're not very excited at all because it's not very valuable, so they're always looking for those colours. So if I was to actually look for some opal myself, can I just start digging in my backyard, or do I need to be somewhere else?
Digging in your backyard, it may work if you're living at Cooper Pedy or in one of the other opal fields, but not where you live at the moment. I don't think you'd find any opals there. But it's interesting how opals, where they come from, and we'll eventually get to talking about the age of the opals and the evidence that indicates that the opals, definitely very powerful evidence that the opals are young and they can form very quickly. But originally, a lot of the opals came out from Hungary. That's where they were provided from. But eventually, Australia started finding opals. And there's certain geological features in Australia which are very conducive to opals. And the opal fields of Australia are in this area. Some are in Queensland, some are in New South Wales, some are in South Australia, and that's where they come from. And eventually, with the development of Australian opals in the 1890s, there's some 90% of the world's supply of opals come from Australia. Now, there's some come from other places, USA, Canada, from Indonesia, places like that. But basically, Australia provides the lion's share of opals to the world.
Cool. So we're in the right country, but not quite the right suburb.
Not quite the right suburb, that's right.
Now, you mentioned the age of opals, and we really want to focus on this a bit more. So tell us more about how old they are.
Well, there was a guy that was on an opal field in New South Wales, and he was concerned about, he actually believed the Bible. And so when the geologists would come around and talk to him and they'd talk about the opals, they'd always talk about hundreds of millions of years. And it used to really annoy him because he thought, I know that they are not that old because what the Bible says. And so he set about as a task, as his purpose in life was to show that you can form opals quickly. And he thought, if I can only sort of think about what the conditions were like during Noah's flood and what different things were going on at that time, I'm sure that I could form opals quickly. And he spent many, many years experimenting. He'd get the sediment, basically the silica sand from the opal field there. He'd use different solutions. He'd put different liquids in on top of, he'd start with a jam jar and he'd put liquids in there. And after lots and lots of failures, he eventually came across a solution to it and was able to form opals. In the 1970s, he was able to form these opals in jam jars, actually Vegemite jars, they used to call them at that time. So what he did, he got that sediment, he put it in the jar, and he had a solution which contains some sort of an organic substance in it as well, connected with silica. So this particular solution, it allowed the silica sand to absorb the water, to become hydrated. And so when he put it in, it wasn't very long before the opal colouring would just start appearing in the sand, and it would be replaced with opal. And sometimes it was as little as, say, 15 minutes, the opal colouring would start to form. But certainly within a few days, say 6 days, 10 days, there was considerable opal colouring would appear in the sand. And it had a band about it, sort of a band of opal colouring. And it was replicated very similar to the way you find opal in the field. And interestingly, it demonstrated that the opal doesn't form in cracks. It actually replaces the sand that's there, replaces the silica that's there, and so it grows within the silica sand itself.
I never would have thought you'd be able to make opal in a matter of weeks. Is it the actual opal, or is it just sort of coloured solution? What's appearing at that time?
Well, it looks just like opal when you look at it in the glass jar. It looks like opal, and this guy's name was Len Cram. And when Len had the opal analysed under an electron microscope. You could see the silica spheres under the electron microscope, just exactly the same as in a real, an opal that forms naturally. And when the opal forms in that particular way, it's a little bit soft like a gel to start with. And so you wouldn't be able to use it for jewellery immediately, but with time it goes hard. The opal actually expels the water from within its structure and it becomes hard like the natural opal that you find in the field.
Okay. Well, that seems pretty cool. So you've got a sort of an experiment environment, in a shed, and he's got the right chemicals and the right sand. Would you expect opals to be able to be formed this quickly in nature without, having a lab and a shed?
Well, the way they talk about them being formed in nature is that it's the rainfall which occurs. It sort of goes down through the little cracks and things in the surface until it gets right down deep, and it absorbs silica as it goes, dissolves things, and then eventually precipitates these opals over a long, long period of time. So that's the story that goes on. There's actual evidence that the opal doesn't form slowly like that in nature. Now, there was at Lightning Ridge, one of the opal fields in New South Wales, they had the first big seminar on opal formation at Lightning Ridge, and one of the professors who was there, he gave a lecture and demonstrated that he found evidence of bacteria in opal, which was found at Lightning Ridge. And so that was interesting because it indicated that there were these living organisms in this particular opal formation, in this opal, this precious stone. And so that indicates that the conditions were such that they formed very quickly, because if they hadn't have formed quickly, you wouldn't have been able to have these bacteria living there. And they were the sort of bacteria that they needed oxygen. They were aerobic bacteria. They needed oxygen to survive. And so this professor said that it was clear that the opal formed quite quickly, very soon after the sediment was actually deposited. So there was a very clear evidence that the opals formed quickly in the field, not just in a chemical in a jar, but in the field. That's a very clear evidence that's there.
Sounds pretty convincing. Have you got any more evidence?
Well, this professor's daughter actually carried on, and she was actually able to identify the types of bacteria, and she was able to identify that there was nutrients connected with the sediments, and so these nutrients were able to provide, keep these bacteria alive, and also it provided evidence that at the time where the sediment was being deposited, that there was a nutrient-rich environment. It was oxygen-rich and nutrient-rich, and they could actually get some indication of the temperatures which were involved. And the temperatures were warmer than the sort of normal oceans, sort of thing. Yeah. And so this indicated that under these conditions where the opals formed, that it fits with the global flood of Noah. So that's the way I sort of look at it, is that during Noah's flood, it's an event which lasted a year, and the waters were coming up in the first 5 months of the flood. That it's documented there in the Bible. And so as the waters were reaching their peak, that's when these opal sediments, where the opal fields are in Australia, it's called the Great Artesian Basin, all those sediments were deposited as the waters were reaching their peak during Noah's flood after the first 5 months. And so at that time, there would have been lots of nutrients in the water because of the vegetation that died and the other animals, the creatures that died during the flood. And so that is consistent with that story. The story of Noah's flood describes that quite well. So I think that's a good evidence that it provides for that.
Yeah, very cool. I've heard of opal stores selling their opals with taglines like, "Beautiful opals, millions of years in the making." It's not true, but I'm sure it would sell well. Now, if you were the store owner, how would you change that tagline to be true?
Yes, that's right. In Coober Pedy, they did have this store. And I remember that you go there and they've got this line which says, when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth, there was this mineral which formed, which captured light and became living, and that sort of thing goes on like that sort of thing. Yeah. And so 100 million years ago, it says, this is what happened. And which is very interesting. I've seen that a lot of places in jewelry stores, millions of years in the making, and you can buy one for your, for your loved one. Actually, opals are desired for the colours and all that sort of thing, and the beautiful features of them. But the people that sell them think they can add an added incentive if they give this little fairy story about dinosaurs and millions of years. So if it was me, connecting it with Noah's flood and all the different rainbow colours in the opals, and Noah's flood, of course, we read there that the rainbow occurred, and at the end of the flood, we read that the rainbow was in the sky, and it was the sign of a covenant that the Creator God made with the earth and everything that lives on it, the people and the animals, everything alive on the earth. And it says, this is my covenant that I will never destroy the world with the flood again. So I'd say something like those opals. They're an amazing sign of an incredible covenant of rainbow, something like that. I tie it into that sort of thing. I don't know if it would sell lots of opals, but that's the sort of line I'd be aiming for.
It'd be true, wouldn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Can you summarize just a few of the things that we've been going through today? Some takeaway points for people to remember.
Well, there is another feature which points to the rapid formation of opals, which I didn't mention before, is that the opals are often found in clay formations. It seems that the clay has got sort of sufficient density and the sediments are sufficiently compacted to be able to absorb the water and produce the opals within the clay. And I know there are various clay formations, say at Lightning Ridge and at Coober Pedy, where the opals form in them. And what they find is that in certain parts of the clay where they're doing the excavations and looking for opals, they find what they call these breccia pipes. Now, breccia means broken rock. And so they find through the clay, there's these pipes like chimneys which go up through the clay, and they're full of all this broken rock. And they can be shaped like a cylinder. They can be shaped like a blunderbuss. They can have various shapes, and they can be just small. For example, just 10 centimeters across, 20 centimeters across, or they can be meters across, these breccia pipes. And so they're called blowholes. And so that's, I think, a good description, like there's been something which is blown out through the clay. Now, the clay is impervious, so it won't let water through very easily, and it's a release of pressure which has occurred. Now, what happened was the sediments were deposited as Noah's flood was increasing, as it was going up on the earth. And that's when these opal horizons were deposited and these clay horizons. But the flood didn't finish there. As it was going up, continued to rise, and there was more sediment on top. And geologists recognize this. They're able to measure pressures and other things around to be able to work out how much sediment was on top of this area. And it was something like 1 or 2 kilometers of sediment.
Wow.
Which is very heavy. And so this puts it under a lot of pressure. And so then after the flood peaked, as the waters were coming off, they eroded the sediment away, which released the pressure. And the pressure would easily be released through a sandstone or sandy sediments. But through the clay, it would build up pressure, and it would be released catastrophically through these blowholes, these blow chimneys, and it would be filled with all this broken material. And so that's another evidence which is very clear of the catastrophic nature of the geology surrounding the formation of these opals. And it's within these sediments right through Queensland and New South Wales and South Australia that it's formed. They also find dinosaur bones in these sediments. As a matter of fact, in South Australia, they find some remains of dinosaurs and marine creatures which are opalized.
Oh, wow.
So that's an incredible find that they make of these opalized creatures. And it's the same sort of thing which happens. There's this chemical solution, this chemical material which is in the pore liquids, which is in the sandstone of this sediment, which has been deposited by Noah's flood, and it's this which causes the opals to form by hydrating the silica.
Yeah, so the flood really explains it all.
The flood explains
Much
it all,
better.
and of course the flood points out that it's not millions of years old. The flood, there's a very clear line of chronology. It's a very clear way of measuring time that we can estimate, not very difficult, that the flood occurred about 4,500 years ago. As a matter of fact, just recently I was with a group of young people, kids really, primary age kids, and we demonstrated how they can work out how long ago things happened. A lot of people say that, well, you believe the Bible. How do you know that it's 6,000 years old? How do you figure out the age of the earth from the Bible? And so I just put out a table, a piece of paper with a table on it, and I gave them the verses of the Bible, and I said, you work out, and they put the numbers of the ages of the different peoples and the genealogies on this table, and they were able to calculate the time between the beginning of the world and Noah's flood, and it's similar to the time after. And so that's how we know the ages of these things, like the opals and the timing of the deposition of the sediments and things like that, because of this. It's an eyewitness account, people who lived at the time. It's not based on assumptions and guesses about measurements of isotopes and things like that, but it's the most reliable way of knowing the age of anything. As a matter of fact, I like to talk to kids and say, ask them their age, and I say, how do you know that? Oh, it's written on the calendar. Well, how do you know that's true? Oh, Mum wrote it there. Well, how do you know that's right? And see, but make the point that the mother was there when he was born. And so that's how you know. So that's how we know the ages. But there's evidence. We pointed out the evidence, the actual evidence that these opals form rapidly, and there's no problem with that at all. They're not millions of years in the making, but they're a rainbow display of a wonderful covenant.
Fantastic. Yeah, so it's really the evidence in the geology and the history of the Bible, and it puts that together to explain.
That puts it together. Yeah. That's the way it works. So it's not a blind faith, but it's a faith that's based on evidence and logic.
So all this information you've been telling us about opals is actually in an article you wrote in Creation Magazine. Can you tell us a bit more about Creation Magazine?
Creation Magazine has lots of amazing articles like this every 3 months when it comes out. The good thing about the magazine is it's easy to read, and it's great to get into the home, into the family. And I love it. My kids loved it. And as a matter of fact, they excelled at science because of what they learned in Creation Magazine. It's like learning without any pain, and that's great.
You can get Creation Magazine today. Have a look in the description below. There's a link there. Click on that, and we'll even throw in a bonus gift if you subscribe. Thanks, Tas.
It's good to be here, Michael.